He had expected a black-edged letter delivered by a slow-moving country solicitor, a quiet notification of a death as inevitable as the winter frost on his neglected northern lands. He had purchased a wife for the express purpose of her quiet, unobtrusive demise, a placeholder duchess to satisfy the gossips in London and then fade into the damp, peaty soil of his family's forgotten estate. He had paid for a ghost. He had planned for silence. He did not expect, a year later, to find smoke pluming from a chimney. He did not expect a repaired gate. He did not expect the scent of baking bread where there should have been only mildew and rot. He did not expect to find her alive. And he certainly, under no circumstances, expected to find that the ghost he had intended to bury had instead become the soul of the very tomb he had sent her to inhabit. Alara Vance stood before the rain-streaked window of the solicitor's office, her reflection a pale, watery ghost she hardly recognized. The world outside was a smear of gray. The clatter of carriage wheels on the wet London cobbles a dull, rhythmic torment. It had been 3 days since the wedding that was not a wedding. 3 days since Lord Ashworth had left her standing at the altar of St. George's, the whispers of the assembled ton like the rustle of dry, venomous snakes in the pews. He had not even had the decency to speak to her himself. His pinched-faced cousin had delivered the message, his words a precise, cruel dagger. His lordship finds, the cousin had lisped, looking her up and down with undisguised contempt, that your constitution is perhaps too robust, too large for the delicate sensibilities of his lineage. Too large. The words had echoed in the hollow space of her chest ever since. She was not a willowy, fainting slip of a girl, it was true. She had bones and muscle and a healthy appetite. Her mother had always called it a blessing, a sign of a sturdy constitution that had seen her through the lung fevers of her youth. But in the eyes of society, in the eyes of the man who was to be her husband, it was a failing, a grotesque abundance. She was a draft horse where he had wanted a porcelain figurine. The humiliation was a physical thing, a thick, sour coating on her tongue, a permanent chill in her bones that the solicitor's meager fire could not touch. Her aunt, Penelope, who had accompanied her, sat hunched in a chair, twisting a damp handkerchief in her bony fingers. "Alara, you must consider it," she urged, her voice a thin, reedy whine. "It is a miracle, a deliverance." Alara did not turn from the window. A miracle felt like warmth and light. This felt like being sold at a cattle auction. The solicitor, Mr. Croft, a man composed entirely of dry paper and dust, had laid out the terms with a complete absence of sentiment. His Grace, the Duke of Wrexham, required a wife. A duchess. Immediately. He had no time for the lengthy courtship and negotiation that such a match would normally entail. His duties to the crown were all-consuming. He required a woman of good birth, sound mind, and, most critically, no significant familial entanglements or expectations of a London season. "You, Miss Vance," Mr. Croft had stated, peering at her over his spectacles, "have, by a stroke of unfortunate luck, become the ideal candidate. Your recent public disappointment has rendered you socially isolated. Your father's debts have left you without a dowry or prospects. You are, if you will forgive the bluntness of the term, unencumbered." Unencumbered. Was that what they called it when your name was a punchline in every drawing room from Mayfair Cheapside? When your only living relative was wringing her hands, desperate to be rid of the financial and social burden of a ruined niece? "He has not even met me," Alara said, her voice flat. The words hung in the air, heavy with the unsaid truth he did not care to. "His Grace's time is not his own," Mr. Croft replied smoothly, as if reciting from script. "The arrangement is simple. You will be married by special license here tomorrow. You will be granted the full rights and title of the Duchess of Wrexham. In return, you will immediately remove yourself to his ancestral home, Blackwood Manor, in Northumberland. You will reside there. You will not come to London. You will not petition him for funds beyond the generous allowance already stipulated. You will not, in short, trouble him." Her aunt let out a small, choked sob of relief. "A duchess. Alara, do you hear? You will be a duchess." Alara heard. She also heard the bars of the cage slamming shut. She was not being offered a life. She was being offered a title in exchange for her disappearance. The Duke of Wrexham was buying her, not as a wife, but as a solution to a problem she could not begin to guess at. He was purchasing her name to paste over his own, and in return, he was giving her a mausoleum in which to live out her days. "Why me?" she asked, finally turning to face the solicitor. Her gaze was direct, her striking, pale eyes holding his. They were the one feature men had always commented on, lucid and intelligent, a stark contrast to the quiet, unassuming demeanor she had been taught to cultivate. Mr. Croft had the grace to look momentarily uncomfortable. He cleared his throat, shuffling his papers. "As I said, your circumstances are uniquely suitable. His Grace requires a wife who will not make demands, a woman without a powerful family to interfere, without a desire for the frivolities of the court." He paused. "Your public jilting, while unfortunate for you, provides a convenient narrative. Society will assume you have retired to the country out of shame, not that you have been placed there." It was breathtaking in its cold, calculated cruelty. Her deepest humiliation was now his greatest convenience. She was a ready-made tragedy, a walking excuse for a reclusive duke. He wasn't just marrying her. He was using the very weapon that had wounded her to build his own fortress of solitude. "And if I refuse?" Ilara's voice was quiet. Her aunt gasped. "Refuse? Ilara, you cannot. We have nothing. The creditors." Mr. Croft's expression did not change. "Then you will return to your aunt's charity, Miss Vance. The wolves, as I believe they are called, are at the door. Your father's estate is forfeit. This is not an offer. It is a lifeline." A lifeline. She looked at her hands, clasped before her. They were capable hands, not the delicate, pale appendages of a society belle. They were hands that had nursed her mother through her final illness, that had tended a small herb garden, that knew the weight of a bucket of water and the texture of mending thread. They were not the hands of a duchess, but they were the hands of a survivor. And what was this, if not a question of survival? The alternative was a slow, grinding descent into poverty, living as the unwanted poor relation in her aunt's cramped, resentful household. It was a death of 1,000 cuts, of polite snubs and turned backs and the constant, gnawing shame of what Lord Ashworth had done to her. This duke, this phantom who bought wives like you a new horse, was offering a different kind of death. A quiet one, in a grand house, with a title to shield her. It was a choice between two prisons. One was small, cramped, and full of whispers. The other was vast, remote, and promised only silence. "I will need to see the allowance figures," she said, her tone suddenly crisp and businesslike, "and the disposition of the Blackwood estate. If I am to be its chatelaine, I will need to understand its holdings, its staff, its income, and its debts." Mr. Croft blinked, surprised. He had expected tears, or swooning, or grateful acquiescence. He had not expected a negotiation. "That is highly irregular, Your Grace." He used the title, and it landed like a stone in the quiet room. "I am not yet Your Grace," Ilara corrected him, a sliver of ice in her voice. "I am still Miss Vance, a woman being asked to trade her life for a title. If the estate I am to be banished to is bankrupt, then the title is worthless, and so is your offer. I am too large for a viscount, Mr. Croft. I assure you, I am large enough to demand the terms of my own sale." For the first time, a flicker of something akin to respect entered the solicitor's dry eyes. He gave a stiff, formal bow. "As you wish, Miss Vance. I will have the ledgers sent round." The journey north was a study in gray misery. The carriage, though well-sprung and bearing the ducal crest that made innkeepers fall over themselves with deference, was a cold, lonely box. Ilara sat alone, wrapped in a heavy woolen cloak, watching the manicured fields of the home counties bleed into the rougher, wilder terrain of the north. The rain began on the second day, a persistent, miserable drizzle that turned the roads to mud and the world outside her window into a weeping watercolor of brown and gray. She did not feel like a duchess. She felt like a parcel, carefully wrapped and addressed to oblivion. The marriage ceremony had been a 5-minute affair in the same solicitor's office. 2 clerks had served as witnesses. The Duke of Wrexham had not been present. He had been represented by proxy, his name spoken aloud by Mr. Croft. She was now married to a signature on a piece of parchment, a man she had never seen. The contract had been as cold as the proposal. She was his wife in name and law. She would bear his title. He, in turn, would be absent. The document had been painfully specific. He would not share her bed, her table, or her life. This was a transaction, and the terms were absolute solitude. After signing the papers, Mr. Croft had handed her a heavy purse of gold sovereigns. "For your immediate needs, Your Grace," he had said. It felt less like a bride's portion and more like a final payment. As the carriage lurched and swayed its way further into Northumberland, the landscape grew more dramatic, more desolate. The hills were stark, ancient things, covered in heather that was a sullen, bruised purple in the damp air. Stone walls, black with age and slick with moss, snaked over the land like the fossilized spines of great serpents. There were more sheep than people. The air that seeped through the cracks in the carriage smelled of wet earth, cold stone, and something else, something wild and lonely that spoke of winter and decay. On the evening of the 4th day, the carriage turned off the main road and onto a private track that was little more than 2 deep ruts in the mud. Overgrown branches scraped against the roof like skeletal fingers. A miasma of damp rose from the sodden ground, a palpable chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. After another mile, they passed through a set of immense, wrought iron gates. One of them hung drunkenly from a single hinge, groaning in the wind. The stone gateposts were crowned with wolves, the Wrexham crest, but their carved faces were obscured by ivy and green slime. This was it, Blackwood Manor. The carriage broke through the tree-line, and she had her first view of the house. Alara's breath caught in her throat. It was not a house. It was a geological feature, a vast, Gothic monstrosity of black stone that seemed to have erupted from the earth itself. It crouched under the bruised twilight sky, 100 lightless windows staring out like vacant eyes. Wings sprawled in every direction, a chaotic jumble of towers and gables and castellated ramparts. It was magnificent in its sheer scale and terrifying in its state of utter neglect. Ivy consumed entire walls. A section of the roof on a distant wing had collapsed entirely, leaving a jagged, black wound open to the sky. It was not a home. It was a tomb, a rotting tooth in the jaw of the desolate landscape. As the carriage drew to a halt on the weed-choked gravel drive, the great front doors opened. A single figure was silhouetted against the gloom within. A man. He was tall, impossibly so, and broad-shouldered, filling the doorframe. Even at this distance, he radiated an aura of stark, uncompromising authority. He was not dressed in the finery of a duke, but in practical, dark woolens, his boots muddy. He walked down the steps with a long, impatient stride, the rain plastering his dark hair to his skull. He did not look at the carriage so much as glare at it, as if its very presence were an affront. The coachman scrambled to open her door. "We've arrived, Your Grace," he mumbled, his face pale. So this was him, the phantom, the Duke of Wrexham, Alistair. He had come to witness the delivery of his package. Alara gathered her cloak around her and stepped out of the carriage, her boots sinking immediately into the soft, wet gravel. The rain was cold, instantly soaking through the hood of her cloak. She stood before him, the wind whipping a strand of hair across her face. He was even more imposing up close. His face was all harsh angles and stark planes, a face that looked as though it had been carved from the same black stone as his house. There were lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes and mouth, but they were the lines of a man worn down by battles, not by age. His eyes, a startlingly pale, wintry gray, swept over her once, a quick, dismissive assessment that took in her plain traveling dress, her rain-soaked cloak, her very existence. There was no flicker of interest, no warmth, no welcome. Nothing. He was a man hollowed out, a man for whom all emotion had been cauterized and scraped away. "You are the Duchess," he stated. It was not a question. His voice was low and resonant, a sound like stones grinding together deep underground. It held the ingrained habit of command, but it was utterly devoid of life. "You are the Duke," she replied, her own voice steadier than she felt. She would not be intimidated. She would not cower. She had been sold, but she would not be chattel. A flicker of something, annoyance, surprise, crossed his face before it was gone. "The terms were explained to you in excruciating detail," she said, the cold rain dripping from her nose. "Good." He gave a curt nod, his gaze already moving past her, toward the waiting darkness of the road he had presumably just traveled. He was eager to leave. He had only stayed to perform this one, final, dismissive act. "Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, will show you to your rooms. The staff, what is left of them, understand the arrangement. This house and its lands are yours to inhabit. Do with them what you will. Let them fall to pieces for all I care." He turned to leave. Alara could not stop herself. The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of it, the coldness that was a physical assault, it broke through her carefully constructed composure. "You sent for a wife, Your Grace. Is it not customary to at least offer her shelter from the rain?" He stopped, his back to her. For a long moment, he did not move. The only sound was the wind and the relentless drumming of the rain. Then, slowly, he turned his head, looking at her over his shoulder. His expression was one of pure, chilling indifference. "I did not send for a wife," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying with perfect, brutal clarity over the wind. "I sent for a solution, a name on a document. I have no interest in your comfort, Duchess. I have no interest in your existence. I came here to ensure you had arrived. You have. My duty is done." He paused, his pale eyes meeting hers. "I expect you to do yours. Be quiet. Be absent. Inhabit your tomb, and do not haunt me." Without another word, he strode past her, not even glancing at the fresh carriage's groom had waiting. He swung himself up onto his own horse, a massive black destrier that looked as ill-tempered as its master. He did not look back. He spurred the horse into a canter, and within moments, he was swallowed by the rain and the gathering dark. Alara stood alone in the driveway of Blackwood Manor, soaked to the bone, the mud seeping into the leather of her boots. She was the Duchess of Wrexham, and her husband had just told her, in no uncertain terms, to die quietly. She looked up at the great black, rotting house. It was not a home. It was a challenge, a sneer of stone and shadow, and it was hers. A gaunt, severe-looking woman in a black bombazine dress appeared at the top of the steps. Her gray hair was scraped back so tightly it seemed to pull her face into a permanent scowl. This had to be Mrs. Gable. "His Grace has departed, then," the woman said, her voice thin and sharp. "You had best come in, Your Grace, before you catch your death." There was no welcome in the words, only a grim, joyless statement of fact. Alara lifted her chin. She took a deep breath of the cold, damp air, a breath that felt like swallowing shards of ice. She started up the steps, her wet cloak leaving a trail on the moss-slicked stone. The house loomed over her, a physical manifestation of the Duke's cold heart. Fine, she thought, a spark of white-hot defiance igniting in the cold, humiliated core of her. Fine. He wanted a ghost in a tomb, but she was not dead yet, and this was her tomb now. She would haunt it on her own terms. The room they gave her was called the State Bedchamber. It was a cavernous, glacial space, 50 feet long with a ceiling that vanished into the upper gloom. A vast, funereal bed draped in rotting damask stood against one wall, its hangings thick with the dust of decades and smelling of mildew and sorrow. A single fire sputtered miserably in a fireplace large enough to roast an ox, its pathetic flames doing nothing to combat the bone-deep chill that radiated from the stone walls. A constant, insidious draft snaked across the floor, carrying the scent of damp and decay. The window, tall and arched, looked out over the same bleak, rain-swept landscape. It was not a bedroom. It was a state-sponsored exercise in misery. Mrs. Gable had shown her to it with a kind of grim satisfaction. His Grace's mother, the late Duchess, passed in this room, she had announced, as if this were a selling point, as did his grandmother. It has always been the Duchess's room. It was a room for dying in. Alara understood that implicitly. It was the room they expected her to die in. For a week, she nearly obliged them. The long, cold journey, the emotional shock, the final, brutal abandonment in the rain, it all conspired to break her. The familiar tightness returned to her chest, the ghost of the lung fevers that had haunted her childhood. It started as a shallow cough, then deepened into a rattling, body-racking affliction that left her weak and breathless. She spent her days in the monstrous bed, the damp sheets clinging to her skin, listening to the wind howl around the turrets of the house like a lament. Mrs. Gable tended to her with a cool, detached efficiency that was worse than outright neglect. She brought thin broth, weak tea, and a constant air of weary expectation. Her every movement seemed to say, "See, just as we thought, another fragile creature for Blackwood to swallow." The two young maids who scurried in and out were terrified, both of the housekeeper and of the spectral Duchess in the giant bed. They moved like mice, their eyes wide, never meeting Alara's. She drifted in a feverish haze, the days and nights blurring into one long, gray expanse of misery. The house itself seemed to be an active participant in her decline. The drafts sought her out. The dampness seeped into her bones. The oppressive silence of the unused wings pressed in on her, a weight of forgotten years. She thought of the Duke, of his cold, empty eyes. He had known this place. He had known its power to crush the spirit. He had sent her here deliberately. This was not just neglect. It was a carefully curated execution. One afternoon, through the fog of her fever, she heard voices in the corridor outside her door. It was Mrs. Gable, and from the sound of his gruff, rumbling tones, the groundsman. "How is she?" the man asked. Alara recognized his voice from a brief, grim introduction on her first day. "Finch." "Fading," Mrs. Gable replied, her voice crisp and devoid of pity. "As expected, she has the look of her predecessor. A London flower. They never last the first winter. Too fragile. His Grace will have his peace soon enough. A London flower." The phrase, coupled with the memory of Lord Ashworth's insult, too large, too robust, struck Alara with the force of a physical blow. The irony was so bitter it almost made her laugh, a sound that came out as a harsh, painful cough. They saw her as a delicate, wilting thing, a woman designed to be broken. Ashworth had rejected her for being too strong, and Wrexham had chosen her because he assumed she was too weak. Both had judged her, weighed her, and found her wanting for their own selfish purposes. Both had sought to define her. And she, lying in this damp, decaying bed, was letting them. She was performing the role they had assigned her, the tragic, sickly Duchess, fading away in her Gothic prison. Something shifted inside her. It was not a gradual dawning, but a sudden, violent snap. A white-hot blade of rage, pure and clean, cut through the feverish fog. It was the same defiance that had made her demand the estate ledgers from Mr. Croft, but magnified 100-fold. No, the word was a silent scream in her mind. She would not die to make a man's life more convenient. She would not fade away to suit their narrative. She had survived poverty, humiliation, and illness before. She would not be defeated by a drafty house and a sour-faced housekeeper. With a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength that shocked her, Alara threw back the heavy, damp covers. The cold air hit her skin, and she gasped, but was a gasp of life, not of sickness. Her legs were shaky, her head swam, but she forced herself to stand. She found her robe, a simple wool dressing gown, and pulled it on. Her reflection in the tarnished mirror of the wardrobe was a fright. A pale, gaunt woman with fever-bright eyes and tangled hair. But the eyes were no longer dull with resignation. They were blazing. She walked to the door, her bare feet shockingly cold on the stone floor. She pulled it open. Mrs. Gable and Mr. Finch were still in the hall. They turned, their expressions of surprise almost comical. The housekeeper's mouth fell open. The groundsman just stared. "Your Grace," Mrs. Gable stammered, recovering herself. "You should not be out of bed." Alara looked past her, her gaze fixing on the groundsman. He was a sturdy, weather-beaten man with kind eyes and earth-stained hands. He looked like part of the landscape, solid and real in a way nothing else in this house was. "Mr. Finch," Alara said, her voice raspy but clear and carrying the unmistakable ring of command. "This room is a death trap. I'm moving out of it. Today." Mrs. Gable stiffened. "But this is the Duchess's suite. This is a tomb." Alara cut her off, her eyes flashing. "And I'm not dead. Find me the smallest, driest room in this house. I don't care if it's an attic storeroom or a servant's cell in the East Wing. As long as it has a sound roof and a fireplace that can be made to draw, I will have it." "You," she said, pinning Mrs. Gable with a look that made the woman take an involuntary step back, "will have my things moved. And then you will bring me the estate ledgers. All of them. Now." She did not wait for a reply. She turned, walked back into the room, and began to dress herself in the warmest clothes she owned. The effort left her breathless and dizzy, but she did not stop. She was no longer a dying woman. She was a living one, and she had just declared war on Blackwood Manor. The room Finch found for her was in a semi-disused wing above the kitchens. It had been a governess's room once, small and square, with a low ceiling and a single, small window that looked out over a walled kitchen garden. It was nothing like the grand, funereal chamber she had left, but the slate roof above it was sound, the floorboards were dry, and the small fireplace, once swept, drew beautifully. The residual heat from the kitchen ovens below lent a faint, constant warmth to the floor. It was a room for living in. The staff, galvanized by the sheer shock of her recovery and the steel in her voice, moved her few belongings. Mrs. Gable did so with a sullen, tight-lipped disapproval, her authority crumbling before her eyes. For the first time, Alara saw fear in the woman's face, the fear of a regime change. Once installed in her new sanctuary, with a roaring fire in the grate and a thick blanket wrapped around her, Alara began her true work. The ledgers arrived in a dusty, precarious stack. There were dozens of them, bound in cracked leather, their pages filled with the spidery, fading script of generations of stewards. Most were in shambles. The accounts of the last 20 years were a disaster of neglect, of bills unpaid, rents uncollected, assets crumbling into ruin. The Duke, it was clear, had been pouring money from his other holdings into this place simply to keep it from collapsing entirely, a constant drain with no oversight. She worked relentlessly. The cough still lingered, and she tired easily, but her mind was sharp and clear. She had a purpose. She started with the house itself. It was a monster, devouring heat and money and manpower. She took a floor plan she found in the estate office and a stick of charcoal from the fire. She began to draw lines. "We are closing the West Wing," she announced to a stunned Mrs. Gable a few days later. "And the North Tower, and the entire third floor of the main block. Board up the connecting doors. Cover the furniture in dust cloths. We will live in the Southeast Wing, above the kitchens, and use the kitchens, the scullery, the estate office, and the small parlor. That is all. But, Your Grace, the staterooms, the ballroom," the housekeeper protested, horrified. "The staterooms are molding, and the ballroom has a hole in its roof. They are a liability," Alara stated flatly. "We are shrinking the house to a size we can manage, a size we can heat." Her next move was even more radical. She had Finch and two of the stronger footmen take her on a tour of the house's vast cellars and storerooms. They were a museum of waste. Tureens of tarnished silver, sets of china for 100 guests, bolts of rotting silk and brocade. She began to make lists. A month later, a wagon loaded with silver, porcelain, and 3 massive, rolled-up Flemish tapestries that had been mildewing on a damp wall rumbled away from Blackwood, bound for the auction houses in Newcastle. Mrs. Gable looked as if she were witnessing a desecration. Alara looked at the heavy purse of coin the agent had given her and saw a new roof for the stables and seed for the spring planting. She turned her attention to the land. She spent hours with Finch, walking the estate, her boots thick with mud, a heavy cloak wrapped around her. He was a revelation. The man knew every field, every stream, every tenant farmer by name. He had been born on this land, as had his father before him. He loved it, and its decay pained him. He had been ignored by the distant duke and his indifferent stewards for years. In Alara, he found a willing, intelligent ear. "The home farm is fallow, your grace," he told her, gesturing to a wide, marshy field. "The drainage tiles collapsed a decade ago. No one would spend the money to fix it." "How much would it cost?" she asked. He told her. It was a significant sum, but less than the cost of the wine the duke's father had apparently consumed in a single year, according to one of the old ledgers. "Hire the men," she said. "We will drain it. And this walled garden," she said, looking at the overgrown plot below her window, "we will clear it. We will plant vegetables, potatoes, cabbages, carrots, things that will grow here, things that will feed us through the winter." Finch stared at her, a slow, wondering smile spreading across his weathered face. He had expected to be serving a ghost. He had found a farmer. His loyalty, which had always been to the land itself, now found a human focus. He became her staunchest ally, her right hand. The staff began to change. The transformation of the Duchess from a sickly invalid to a formidable, pragmatic force was a source of endless gossip and awe below stairs. She was not a conventional aristocrat. She did not demand to be waited on. She was more likely to be found in the kitchen discussing menus with the cook, menus based on what was available and affordable, or in the garden with Finch, her hands dirty, than in a drawing room. She was blunt, fair, and missed nothing. The lazy and inept were dismissed. The hardworking were rewarded with better pay, funded by the sale of useless heirlooms, and, more importantly, with her respect. Mrs. Gable was the last bastion of the old order. She fought Alara at every turn, a passive-aggressive war of misplaced items, forgotten instructions, and constant, muttered complaints about the decline in standards. The final battle came over the matter of wood smoke. Alara, in her quest to make the house warm, had ordered every usable fireplace in their small, inhabited section to be kept lit. The result was a constant, comforting haze of wood smoke that clung to the drapes and her clothes. "The house smells like a peasant's cottage, Your Grace," Mrs. Gable complained, her nose wrinkled in disgust. "The soot will ruin the fabrics." Alara, who was poring over a drainage map with Finch at the kitchen table, looked up. "The fabrics are already 200 years old and smell of mold. I prefer the smell of warmth, the smell of life. If you find it so disagreeable, Mrs. Gable, perhaps you would be more comfortable elsewhere." The ultimatum hung in the air. It was a direct challenge. Accept the new way or leave. A week later, Mrs. Gable, her face a mask of thunderous indignation, departed in a hired trap, bound for his sister's house in Durham. The remaining staff breathed a collective sigh of relief. The house felt lighter, cleaner. Spring bled into a cool, green summer. The home farm was drained and planted. The kitchen garden flourished under the long hours of northern daylight. Alara herself flourished with it. The cough was gone, replaced by a strength and vitality she hadn't felt in years. The country air, the hard work, the sense of purpose, it was a better tonic than any doctor could have prescribed. She was still slender, but she was no longer frail. Her skin, once paper pale, now had a healthy glow. The insult of being too large seemed like a joke from another lifetime. Here, her robustness was a virtue, a necessity. The house was transformed. It was no longer a tomb. By concentrating all their life and energy into one small corner of a vast structure, Alara had created a fortress. A warm, well-fed, functional keep against the wilderness outside and the neglect within. Smoke plumed from its chimneys. The windows glowed with lamplight in the evenings, and the scent of baking bread and rosemary from the garden replaced the cloying smell of decay. She rarely thought of the Duke. He was an abstraction, a name on a page, the source of the funds that she was now managing with ruthless efficiency. He had abandoned her to this place, but in doing so, he had given her a kingdom. She had stopped being the Duchess of Wrexham in any social sense. She was the master of Blackwood. One crisp afternoon in late autumn, a year after her arrival, she was in the estate office, a small, stone-flagged room that now served as the nerve center of her entire operation. She had her sleeves rolled up, a smudge of ink on her cheek, and was arguing cheerfully with Finch over the best place to store the potato harvest. The sound of a horse at a full gallop on the gravel drive made them both fall silent. It was a sound they never heard. Visitors did not come to Blackwood. She walked to the window and looked out. A massive black horse, lathered in sweat, was pulled to a skidding halt. The rider swung himself down. He was tall, dressed in dark, travel-stained clothes, and moved with an air of bone-deep exhaustion. It was the Duke, her husband. He had returned to his tomb, and he was about to find it fiercely, defiantly alive. Alastair, Duke of Wrexham, rode with the devil on his shoulder. For the last year, he had been in the crucible of London, fighting a shadow war in the corridors of power, a battle against corruption, against enemies of the crown who wore the faces of friends. He had fought with his usual weapons, cold logic, ruthless strategy, and an utter disregard for his own well-being. And he had lost. Not a decisive, open defeat, but a slow, grinding attrition that had cost him everything. His political alliances were shattered. His name was tainted by a scandal he had tried to uncover, and a man he had trusted had betrayed him, turning his own plans against him. He was broken. Not his body, but his spirit, the core of him that had been forged in war and politics. It had cracked. He had fled London without a word to anyone, riding north like a man possessed. He had only one destination in mind, Blackwood, the great stone mausoleum of his family. He was not going there to live. He was going there for silence, for an ending. He yearned for the cold, the damp, the absolute, soul-crushing neglect of the place. He wanted to be swallowed by it, to let the rot and the silence seep into him until he was as empty as its halls. He remembered the woman he had left there, the pale, quiet creature with the startling eyes. He assumed, with a distant, detached part of his mind, that she was dead. He had sent her to a place designed to kill the weak, and she had seemed the very definition of fragile. He vaguely recalled a letter from his solicitor months ago, mentioning that the new Duchess had dismissed the old housekeeper and sold some silver, but he had dismissed it as the last thrashing of a dying creature. He expected to find her grave in the local churchyard. The first sign that something was wrong, or rather, not as expected, was the gate. It was fixed. It swung open smoothly, its hinges oiled. An insignificant detail, yet it was a note of order in the symphony of decay he had been anticipating. Then, as he rode up the long drive, he saw that the low-hanging branches had been trimmed back. The relentless ivy had been hacked away from the front of the house, revealing the clean, dark lines of the stone beneath. And then he saw the smoke. Not the pathetic trickle from a single, barely tended fire he might have imagined, but a healthy, confident plume of gray smoke rising from a chimney stack on the southeast wing. It spoke of warmth, of life, of a hearth well tended. It was an affront to the perfect desolation he had come seeking. He dismounted, his legs stiff, his body aching with a weariness that went far beyond the long ride. The air did not smell of mildew. It smelled of wood smoke, and beneath that, something else, apples, roasting meat. He frowned, disoriented. He walked up the steps he had last ascended in a cold fury a year ago. They were clean, free of moss. The great oak door was not locked. It opened under his hand. The great hall was cold and silent, as he remembered, but it was not dark. The vast, grimy window at the far end had been washed, and the pale autumn light poured in, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the air. The furniture was shrouded in clean white cloths, orderly ghosts at rest. A thick, heavy door leading to the west wing had been boarded over. He saw another like it blocking the main staircase to the upper floors. Someone had been pruning his house. He followed the faint sounds of life, a distant clatter, the murmur of voices, through the hall and down a corridor he hadn't used in 20 years. The air grew warmer with every step. He passed a small parlor, and through the open door, he saw a fire blazing in the hearth, a book left open on a chair, a vase of late-blooming chrysanthemums on a table. It was a room that was lived in, a pocket of impossible comfort in the heart of the ruin. The corridor opened into the back of the house, near the kitchens. The door to the old steward's office was ajar, and inside he saw her. She was not in a bed, fading away. She was not a ghost. She was standing at a large table covered in maps and papers, arguing with his groundsman, Finch. Her back was to him, but he could see the energy in her posture, the confident line of her shoulders. Her dark hair was pinned up in a simple, practical knot, and she wore a plain wool dress that looked durable and warm. Her sleeves were rolled to her elbows, revealing strong, capable forearms. A smudge of ink adorned one cheek. Finch saw him first. The man's jaw dropped. He made a strangled noise and took a step back, his weathered face paling. Your Grace. She turned. The woman who faced him was not the one he remembered. The frail, pale creature from the solicitor's office was gone. This woman was vibrant. Her face had color. Her body had a solid, grounded strength. But it was her eyes that held him. Those same startlingly lucid eyes, but now they were not filled with fear or humiliation. They were sharp, intelligent, and utterly, unequivocally in command. They swept over him, taking in his disheveled state, his exhaustion, his very presence, with a cool, assessing glance. He was so taken aback, so completely thrown by the chasm between his expectation and this reality, that the only words that came out were blunt, stupid, and accusatory. You are alive. A small, dangerous smile touched her lips. It did not reach her eyes. I apologize for the inconvenience, she said, her voice a low, melodic thing with an unmistakable edge of steel. I'm told it is a temporary condition for all of us, but I do try to postpone the inevitable. Alistair stared at her. He felt like a man who had kicked a tombstone only to have it rise up and speak to him. He was the Duke. This was his house. But the air in this room belonged to her. The authority in it radiated from her. Finch was looking at her, not at him, waiting for his cue. What have you done? He asked, his voice a rough growl. He gestured vaguely at the room, the house, the entire impossible situation. I believe the term is housekeeping, she replied, her tone dry. I tidied up. You left a mess. She picked up a ledger from the table, her movements calm and deliberate. Though I confess, I did not expect the master of the house to return. I was under the impression you had forgotten this place existed. This place is mine, he said, the words coming out harsher than he intended. It was a reassertion of a fact that suddenly felt unstable. Legally, yes, she agreed, tapping the ledger. Financially, it was a sinking ship which I have endeavored to keep afloat. Pragmatically, it is my home. You are, I am afraid, a guest. The sheer audacity of it left him speechless. He had come here to collapse, to let the silence and the shadows take him. Instead, he had walked into a revolution. He, the Duke of Wrexham, was being informed he was a guest in his own ancestral home by the woman he had sent here to die. I am not a guest, he bit out, stepping fully into the room. The space suddenly felt very small. He was used to commanding rooms, to having people shrink away from his presence. She did not. She stood her ground, watching him with that unervingly direct gaze. Are you not? She countered, raising an eyebrow. You have no room here, Your Grace. Your ancestral bedchamber is under a dust sheet and smells of mothballs. The wing it occupies is colder than a crypt. The staff, such as they are, take their orders from me. Cook is currently roasting a chicken for my dinner. If you wish to join me, you will have to ask politely. So yes, a guest. Every word was a perfectly aimed dart, puncturing his authority, his assumptions, his entire worldview. He felt a surge of raw, frustrated anger. He had not felt anything so strongly in a year. I am the Duke, he began, his voice rising. And I am the Duchess, she interrupted, her voice dropping, becoming quiet and dangerous. A title you bestowed upon me. You gave me this house. You told me to do with it what I will. I have. You told me not to trouble you. For a year, I have not. You are the one who has appeared on my doorstep, unannounced and unexpected. You are the one causing the trouble. She was magnificent, ink-stained, dressed like a farmer's wife, but radiating more power than any jeweled and corseted woman he had ever seen at court. She had taken the ruin he had given her and forged it into a fortress, and herself into its queen. He had come here seeking a grave and had found a living, breathing kingdom he did not recognize. A young maid appeared in the doorway, her eyes wide with fear at the sight of him. She ignored him completely, her gaze fixed on Alara. "Beg pardon, Your Grace." Cook asks, "Will the Duke be staying for dinner?" "She'll need to put another potato in the pot." The absurd, domestic detail of it was the final straw. It was so far from the epic, silent decay he had craved. It was real. It was organized. And he was an afterthought, an extra potato in the pot. The situational irony was so profound it almost broke through his exhaustion. Alara did not look at him. She kept her eyes on the maid. "We do not know the Duke's plans, Mary," she said calmly, "but set a place for him. It is the polite thing to do for a stranger who has come in from a cold." She finally turned her gaze back to him. There was no triumph in it, only a cool, clear challenge. The unspoken question hung in the air between them. "What are you going to do now, Your Grace?" Alistair felt the foundations of his world, already cracked, begin to crumble. He was an intruder, a ghost in a house that had, against all odds, come back to life. The days that followed were a cold war fought across a dinner table. Alistair stayed. He had nowhere else to go. The energy required to leave was more than he possessed. So he remained, a thunderous, silent presence in Alara's well-ordered world. He took a room in the inhabited wing, a small, Spartan chamber that was nevertheless warm and clean. He ate the food her cook prepared, food grown in the gardens she had planted. He was a king in exile in his own castle. He watched her. He saw her rise at dawn and work until long after dusk. He saw the easy respect she commanded from the staff, the way Finch would bring her a choice vegetable from the garden like an offering, the way the maids would smile in her presence. She had not won their loyalty through fear or rank. She had earned it through competence and shared work. They were not her servants. They were her people. He tried to reassert his authority once. He had summoned Finch to the hall, intending to demand an accounting of the changes made to the estate. The groundsman had come, his hat in his hands, his expression uneasy. "You report to me now, Finch," Alistair had said, his voice flat and hard. Finch had shuffled his feet, his gaze darting towards the estate office. "Ah, Your Grace. Of course, Your Grace. It's just. Her Grace has the planting schedules and the new drainage plans. We were just going over them. If you've questions about the land, she's the one to ask. She knows it now, better than anyone." It was a polite, deferential mutiny. Finch's loyalty was not for sale. It had already been given, freely, to the woman who had brought his beloved land back from the brink. Alistair had dismissed him, the bitter taste of irrelevance in his mouth. He was a figurehead, a portrait on the wall. The real power sat in the estate office, with ink on her fingers. Alara, for her part, treated him with a cool, impeccable courtesy that was more infuriating than open hostility. She called him Your Grace. She ensured his needs were met. She included him in conversation at dinner, asking polite, impersonal questions about the weather or the state of the roads from London. She treated him exactly as she had described, a guest, a visitor to be managed. The tension between them was a constant, thrumming presence. The small parlor, warmed by its fire, felt charged with it. The silences were not comfortable. They were battlefields of unspoken resentments and challenged assumptions. "You sold the Mortlake tapestries," he said one evening, staring into the fire. He had noticed their absence from the shrouded great hall. "I did," she replied from her chair, not looking up from the stockings she was darning. "They were rotting, and I needed to pay for the seed potatoes. They had been in my family for 300 years. And in 300 years, none of your family had thought to fix the roof in the gallery where they were hanging," she countered, her needle moving in steady, precise stitches. Sentiment does not keep out the rain, your grace. A sound roof does. The potatoes, I am happy to report, were an excellent crop. He could not argue with her logic. It was infuriating. It was irrefutable. She had stripped the house of its decaying grandeur and given it something far more valuable, a future. He had wanted to preside over its death, and she had forced it to live. The resentment he felt was illogical, he knew. It was the anger of a man whose suicide has been interrupted. His past, the reason he had come here, began to haunt him in the quiet of the northern nights. The political ruin, the betrayal, it was a wound that would not close. He had nightmares, waking in a cold sweat, the shouts of Parliament and the sneering face of his enemy vivid in his mind. During the day, he was listless, a ghost prowling the edges of Alara's vibrant world. He would walk for hours on the moors, the cold wind a welcome punishment, trying to outpace the failure that clung to him like a shroud. He saw the house not as it was, but as it had been. He saw the ghosts of his cold, distant father and his perpetually disappointed mother. He saw the long, lonely corridors of his childhood. This house had never been a home. It had been a duty, a burden, a place of echoing silence. He had hated it, and yet he hated what she had done to it more, because her success was a mirror to his own spectacular failure. She had built a world from nothing, while he had allowed his to be torn down. The outside world found them, as it always does. A letter arrived, carried by a local boy from the village. It was addressed to the Duchess of Wrexham. Alara opened it with a frown, her brow furrowing as she read. Alistair watched her, a strange curiosity piercing his apathy. "What is it?" he asked, his voice rusty from disuse. She looked up, and for the first time since his arrival, he saw not a formidable queen, but a flicker of the woman he had first met, a shadow of vulnerability in her eyes. "It is from a solicitor," she said slowly, "acting on behalf of Lord Ashworth." The name meant nothing to him. "He was the man I was to marry," she clarified, her voice tight. Alistair felt a sudden, sharp, and entirely unwelcome jolt of something that felt dangerously like possessiveness. "What does he want?" "Money, of course," she said, a bitter twist to her lips. "He has fallen on hard times. He has discovered that I am now a duchess. He claims my father owed him a significant sum, a gambling debt. He knows it is a lie, but he threatens to make the claim public. He threatens to create a scandal, to drag your name and my own through the mud by dredging up the details of our arrangement." She looked at him, her face pale. "He is attempting blackmail." The threat was not to him. Not really. His name was already tarnished in London. A scandal about his strange marriage would be a mere footnote. The threat was to her. It was an attack on the new life she had built, on the dignity she had clawed back from the humiliation Ashworth had inflicted on her. It was an attempt to reduce her, once again, to a helpless victim. "He believes me to be defenseless," she said softly, staring at the letter as if it were a snake. A lone woman in a remote house. An easy target. Before he could process his own reaction, the weather, which had been darkening all day, broke with a spectacular violence. The sky turned a bruised purple-black, and a torrential rain, driven by a gale-force wind, began to hammer against the windows. The house groaned. A sudden, vicious gust of wind forced its way down the chimney, sending a shower of sparks and a puff of acrid smoke into the room. Alara started, her hand flying to her chest. She began to cough. It was not the lingering rasp he had occasionally heard from her. This was different. This was a deep, tearing, uncontrollable spasm. It bent her double, stealing her breath. Her face, already pale, became ashen. She pressed a hand to her side, a look of sharp pain on her features. "Alara," he said, moving towards her, the name slipping out unbidden. She waved a weak hand at him, trying to speak, but another paroxysm seized her. The sound was horrifying, a wet, ragged tearing that spoke of inflamed lungs and a desperate fight for air. He saw it then, the fragility she had buried so deep beneath her strength. The overwork, the stress of his arrival, and now this threat from her past, It had all conspired with the brutal turn in the weather to break through her defenses. The ghost of her old illness had returned, and it had returned with a vengeance. She swayed on her feet, her eyes wide with a mixture of pain and panic. He reached her just as her knees gave way, catching her in his arms. She was terrifyingly light. Her body was racked with tremors, and her skin was clammy, yet she burned with a fierce, dry heat. The formidable Duchess, the master of Blackwood, had vanished. In his arms was a desperately ill woman, fighting for every single breath. And in that moment, the apathy that had encased Alistair's heart for a year shattered into a million pieces, replaced by a single, sharp, terrifying emotion. Fear. He was terrified of losing her. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing. The blackmail letter from Lord Ashworth fluttered from her grasp and landed by the fire, forgotten. The Cold War was over. A new and far more desperate battle had just begun. Alistair carried her through the quiet corridors to her room, the small, warm space she had carved out for herself. He laid her on the bed, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The maid, Mary, appeared in the doorway, her face a mask of terror. "Get hot water," he commanded, his voice sharp with an authority he hadn't used in weeks. But it was different now, honed not by anger but by urgency. "And blankets. And send Finch for the doctor in Alnwick. Tell him to ride, as if the devil is chasing him." The girl vanished. He was alone with Alara. He felt a helplessness that was entirely new to him. He was a man of action, of strategy. He knew how to fight political enemies and command armies. He did not know how to fight a fever. He did not know how to soothe the ragged edges of a body at war with itself. He touched her forehead. It was burning. Her eyes were closed, her face tight with pain. He loosened the collar of her dress, his fingers clumsy. He took a cloth from the wash basin, dipped it in the cool water, and began to bathe her face. It was an intimacy that was shocking, terrifying. He had signed a contract to never touch this woman, and now he was tending to her as she lay helpless in her bed, the scent of lavender and her own warm skin rising to meet him. For 2 days, the storm raged outside, and a quieter, more desperate storm raged within the small room. The doctor came, a bluff, weary man who smelled of whiskey and damp wool. He examined Alara, listened to her chest, and his expression was grim. "A severe inflammation of the lungs," he pronounced, shaking his head. "Her constitution is strong, your grace, but she's been pushed past its limits. The old weakness has returned. It is in God's hands now. He left powders of questionable efficacy and instructions for broth and rest." God's hands were not good enough for Alistair. He took control. He did not leave her side. He sat in a chair by her bed, watching the rise and fall of her chest, a movement that seemed at times almost to cease. He forced spoonfuls of broth and water between her parched lips. He changed the cool cloths on her forehead. He listened to her delirious muttering, fragments of memory from her life before him. A father's name, the sting of an insult, the price of seed. Her entire pragmatic, resilient world broken into feverish shards. In the quiet hours of the night, with the wind howling its mournful song, he found himself talking to her, not because he thought she could hear, but because the silence was unbearable. He told her about the political battles, the betrayal, the crushing weight of a duty that had given him nothing back. He spoke of his cold childhood in this very house. He confessed the reason he had come back, to find an ending. "I came here to fail in peace," he whispered, his voice rough, into the dim, fire-lit room. "I wanted the silence. I wanted the rot. You denied me that. You built a life here. And now," he looked at her still, pale form. "Now, all I want is for you to keep living it." While he kept his vigil, another part of his mind, the cold, strategic part, dealt with the other threat. He had not forgotten Lord Ashworth. He had retrieved the letter. On the second day of Alara's illness, he wrote 2 of his own. One was to his solicitor in London, Mr. Croft. The instructions were precise, brutal, and left no room for error. They involved the calling in of debts, the whispering of rumors in the right ears, the quiet, systematic dismantling of a man's reputation and financial standing. Lord Ashworth had wanted to use scandal as a weapon. Alistair was a master of that particular warfare. He would not just silence Ashworth, he would erase him. The second letter was to Ashworth himself. It was very short. It contained no threats. It simply stated that the Duke of Wrexham was now taking a personal interest in his affairs, and that he would be hearing from the Duke's solicitor shortly. For a man like Ashworth, a man whose life was built on credit and reputation, it was a death sentence. He sent Finch, who had been hovering with a worried, helpless expression, to dispatch the letters. Alistair was using the power he had so long associated with his own misery, his title, his connections, his ruthlessness. But for the first time, he was wielding it not for the crown, not for an abstract notion of duty, but as a shield. He was protecting her. He was protecting her work, her home, her peace. He was protecting their home. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. In his mind, Blackwood was no longer his tomb. It was her creation, and it was theirs. On the third night, the fever broke. He was dozing in the chair, exhausted, when a small sound woke him. He looked over. Alara's eyes were open. They were clear. The feverish glaze was gone. She was looking at him. "Alistair," she whispered, her voice a dry, fragile thread of sound. He was across the room in an instant, kneeling by her bed. "I am here." "You stayed," she said, a hint of wonder in her voice. "I stayed," he confirmed. She was weak, terribly so, but she was lucid. She looked around the room, at the fire, at the chair pulled close to her bed. She looked at his unshaven jaw, the exhaustion in his eyes. He saw the understanding dawn on her face. He had cared for her. He, the man who had banished her, had sat vigil at her bedside. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling onto her temples. Not tears of pain or sadness, but of something else, something overwhelming and complex. "The storm," she whispered. "Is it over?" He glanced at the window, where the first pale light of dawn was breaking against a calm, quiet sky. "Yes," he said, his gaze returning to her face. "The storm is over." Section. In the quiet days of Alara's recovery, a fragile truce settled over Blackwood. The house itself seemed to be holding its breath. The raw, urgent terror of the illness had passed, leaving behind a space filled with a new, uncertain awareness. Alistair found himself adrift. His role as a desperate caregiver had vanished, and he had not yet figured out what was to replace it. He tried to give her space, retreating to the role of a distant guardian, but the house she had designed was too intimate for that. Their lives were intertwined now, not by a legal document, but by the shared experience of the crisis. He found he could not return to his silent, brooding walks. His feet, of their own accord, kept him circling the small, inhabited wing, his senses tuned to any sound from her room. A week after her fever broke, he found her out of bed. She was in the kitchen, a thick shawl wrapped around her shoulders, sitting at the large wooden table where she conducted so much of her business. She was pale and moved slowly, but she was attempting to peel a potato, her hand still slightly unsteady. The cook, a stout woman named Mrs. Potter, was hovering nearby, wringing her hands. "Your Grace, you should be resting," Mrs. Potter fretted. "Let me do that." "I've been resting for a week, Mrs. Potter," Alara said, her voice still weak but firm. "If I lie in that bed for another day, I will grow roots. I need to do something." The potato slipped from her grasp, rolling onto the floor. A flush of frustrated color appeared in her pale cheeks. Alistair stepped into the room. He walked past them, picked up the kettle from the hearth, and set about making tea. The domesticity of the act was foreign to him. He was a duke. He did not make tea, yet it felt like the only right thing to do. Mrs. Potter watched him, her eyes wide, as he found the tea caddy and spoons, his movements methodical and precise. He placed a steaming cup on the table in front of Alara. She looked up at him, surprised. The warmth of the mug was a small, solid anchor in the uncertain space between them. "Thank you," she said softly. He sat down opposite her, his own cup cradled in his hands. The silence was different now. It was not the weaponized silence of their early days together, but a quiet, waiting thing. "I read the accounts while you were unwell," he said, breaking it. He had needed something to do, something to focus his anxious energy on, and had turned to her ledgers. "You have performed a miracle here." She gave a small, self-deprecating shrug. "It is just common sense. One cannot heat a cathedral with a single log. I simply made the house smaller." "It is more than that," he insisted. "You gave it a heart." He looked at her, truly looked at her, seeing the lingering fragility beneath the defiant spark. "The doctor said you had pushed yourself too far." Her gaze dropped to the table. "I thought I was past that weakness. I thought I had left it behind in London." It was a confession of her deepest fear, the fear of her own body betraying her, of being returned to that state of helpless fragility. "It is not a weakness, Elara," he said, his voice quiet but intense. "It is a part of you, just as this house is a part of me." He paused, the words of his own confession forming slowly. "I told you I came here to fail. It was true. I was ruined in London, betrayed by men I trusted. My work, my life's purpose, turned to ash. I came here to be buried in it." She looked up, her lucid eyes searching his. "You have made that difficult," she finished for him, echoing his own thoughts from her bedside. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Yes, you have." In that quiet moment, over tea in a warm kitchen, the last of the walls between them crumbled. He was not just the cold duke, and she was not just the pragmatic survivor. They were two wounded people who had, by accident, found a strange solace in each other's presence. The partnership began the next day. She was still weak, confined to a chair by the parlor fire, but her mind was restless. "The winter planting schedules are not finished," she fretted, "and Finch needs to know how many of the lambs we can afford to keep." "Then tell me," Alistair said, pulling a small table to her side. "I will be your hands." He brought her the ledgers and the maps. She, the undisputed master of Blackwood's practical realities, dictated. He, with his neat, precise hand and his mind for strategy, wrote. They worked together. He learned the names of the tenant farmers and the yields of their fields. She learned that he had a surprisingly quick grasp of crop rotation and animal husbandry. He discovered the intricate, beautiful system she had built, a system based not on profit, but on sustainability and care. She was not just managing an estate, she was nurturing a community. She had arranged for the surplus from the kitchen garden to go to the poorest families. She had paid the tenants for their labor in repairing the estate walls, rather than demanding it as their due. "This is not how an estate is run," he remarked, looking over the numbers. "This is charity. It is an investment," she corrected him gently. "A hungry tenant cannot work. A resentful tenant will not work well. A man who feels his landlord is fair will give you his best. It is just practical." He looked at her, at the quiet certainty on her face, and felt a profound sense of awe. He had spent his life dealing with the grand, cynical machinations of empires and kings, a world of power for power's sake. She had built a better, more honest world in this forgotten corner of his land, based on a simple, radical principle, decency. One afternoon, they were bent over a large map of the estate spread across the table. She was pointing out a section of woodland that needed thinning. She leaned forward, and a wave of dizziness from a recent illness washed over her. She swayed, her hands slipping on the paper. Instinctively, he reached out, his large hand covering hers to steady it. The contact was like a bolt of lightning. It was not a romantic touch, not a caress. It was a simple, grounding act of support. But for both of them, it was monumental. It was the first time they had touched outside the desperate context of her illness. His hand was warm and strong over hers. She did not pull away. He did not let go. They stayed like that for a long moment, the map forgotten, the world shrinking to the point of contact between their hands. The warmth of his skin, the solid reality of him, her slender fingers beneath his palm. It was an anchor, a promise. He finally drew his hand back, his heart hammering in his chest. She tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, a flush on her cheeks. They did not speak of it. They did not have to. Something new had been forged between them in the quiet aftermath of the crisis. A partnership that was beginning to feel like something more. The silence that fell between them now was easy, comfortable. It was the silence of two people working in tandem, a shared quiet that was more eloquent than words. As the first snows of winter began to dust the high moors, a rider appeared on the horizon. He was not a local boy on a pony, but a royal courier, his horse lathered, his uniform crisp despite the long journey. He carried a dispatch sealed with the king's own crest. The old world had come calling. The courier was brought into the hall, which was still cold and shrouded, a deliberate choice by Alistair to meet the man on neutral, unwelcoming ground. The arrival of the dispatch was a violation, an intrusion of the world he had fled into the sanctuary he had found. Alara stood just inside the parlor door, watching. The moment she saw the royal seal, she felt a familiar, cold dread settle in her stomach. She saw the set of Alistair's jaw, the way his shoulders squared as he took the leather pouch. This was it. The truce was over. His real life, his duties to the crown and the world of men, had found him. Of course it had. He was the Duke of Wrexham. He did not belong here, darning stockings and discussing potato harvests. That had been a temporary reprieve, an interlude. She had been a fool to let herself believe it could be anything more. Her defenses, so recently lowered, slammed back into place with the force of a portcullis. The warmth of the past few weeks, the easy partnership, the shocking intimacy of his hand on hers, it all evaporated, leaving behind the cold, hard reality of their original arrangement. He was the Duke. She was the placeholder. Alistair read the dispatch, his face impassive. A crisis in Parliament. A key ally faltering. His enemies circling. The king did not request his presence. He commanded it. He was being summoned back to the heart of the fire he had fled. He looked up, and his eyes met Alara's across the cold expanse of the hall. He saw the change in her instantly. The warmth was gone, replaced by a cool, formal mask. Her posture was stiff, her expression remote. She had already accepted his departure. She was already preparing for his absence. Later that day, she approached him in the estate office. She was all business, the efficient chatelaine once more. "I will have Mrs. Potter pack you provisions for the journey, Your Grace," she said, her voice crisp and impersonal. "Finch can have your horse ready within the hour. The roads south are clear for now, but more snow is forecast, so you should leave as soon as possible." She did not ask if he was going. She assumed it. She was protecting herself, retreating behind a wall of practicality before he could announce his abandonment of her. It was a pain so sharp he almost flinched. He had earned her trust, inch by painful inch, and now, with the arrival of a single piece of paper, it was gone. He let her continue, let her detail the arrangements for his departure with a brisk, heartbreaking efficiency. She was giving him his freedom, pushing him away, making it easy for him to do what she believed he was always going to do. When she was finished, she gave a small, formal nod. "I wish you a safe journey, Your Grace." She turned to leave. "Alara." His voice stopped her. She did not turn around. He walked towards her, stopping just behind her. He could smell the faint, clean scent of her hair. In his hand, he still held the king's dispatch. "Look at me," he said softly. Slowly, reluctantly, she turned. Her face was a pale, beautiful mask of control, but he could see the hurt shimmering in the depths of her lucid eyes. "You assume I am leaving," he said. It was not a question. "It is your duty," she replied, her voice tight. "The king commands it." "I have served the king my entire life," he said, his voice low and intense. "I have served the idea of England. I have given my youth, my health, my soul to a duty that hollowed me out and left me with nothing but ash. I came here a broken man to a broken house. And you," he reached out, his fingers gently touching the ink smudge that was almost permanently on her cheek now. "You build a world here, a real world, a warm 1 inch. He held her gaze, letting her see the absolute sincerity in his eyes. "My duty is no longer to a crown in London. My duty is to the woman who taught me what a home is. My duty is here." With a deliberate, symbolic movement, He walked to the fireplace in the hall, the great, cavernous thing that had been cold for decades until she had brought it back to life. The courier was gone, but the fire she had ordered lit that morning still burned brightly. He held the dispatch over the flames. The wax seal melted, dripped, and then the parchment caught, curling into a black ash. He dropped it into the heart of the fire. He had just committed an act of treason. He had defied a direct order from his sovereign, and he had never felt more free. He turned back to her. She was staring at the fire, at the last remnants of the king's command turning to nothing. Her mask was cracking, her composure crumbling. He walked back to her, closing the space between them until he was standing so close he could feel the warmth of her body. He gently took her face in his hands. "You are my home, Elara," he said, the words a vow, a truth he had discovered in the darkest hours of her illness. "Not this house, not this land. You." That was what finally broke her. A single, perfect tear welled and traced a path through the faint dust on her cheek. The dam of her control, her pride, her fear of being abandoned again, it all gave way. A choked sob escaped her, and she leaned into him, her forehead resting against his chest, her hands clutching the front of his coat as if she were drowning, and he was the only solid thing in the world. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her tightly, protectively. He buried his face in her hair, breathing in her scent. She was not a solution. She was not a placeholder. She was the center of his world. They stood like that for a long time, two solitary, wounded figures who had found each other in the ruins. Outside, the first flakes of the promised snow began to fall, soft and white against the gray sky, blanketing the wild land. But inside the walls of Blackwood, in the small, warm corner of the world they had forged together, winter had lost its sting. The house was no longer a tomb. It was a fortress. It was a home, and it was fiercely, defiantly, completely alive. And as he held her, Alistair knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that they were no longer two separate people. They were a single, permanent fixture, rooted in the soil of their shared struggle, ready to face whatever came next, together. They were whole.